Hey watercolor wizards, Hajra here. Today we'll be traveling to Alaska to paint some majestic polar bears and frozen ice caps. This is an easier painting project, done with watercolor crayons or pastels, which I used as pre-wetted globs of paint and not as drying crayons. So I saw these cool old national park posters online, sort of as an artistic advertisement for the various parks and natural attractions in the US, and I really liked how they ended up promoting nature and wildlife. I wanted to do my own original version, and I may do more than one, but this time I did polar bears. The posters are done in a very simplified, high contrast graphic art style with sharp shapes and limited colors that end up looking like screen printing. The ice and snow one of the posters was done in these really cool jagged shapes, and it called to mind the same sort of texture that you can get using plastic Seran wrap when you use it with watercolors. So I decided to create shards of stylized snow and ice for an easy background and foreground that I could then quickly plop some bears on. So I put in a passage of wet paint and put the plastic down on top while the paint is still good and wet, smushing it around so it sticks in certain areas and abstract shapes. You can add more paint while it's still wet to intensify the color, and then you just leave it alone and take it off when it's all dry. It results in easy, very intriguing shapes, and you may have seen me show it in my 77 techniques video. The thick, creamy watercolor crayon really grabs that texture, so it works very well with the plastic wrap technique. Because it is thicker and drier than transparent watercolor, it also holds the shapes and dries really fast. Here I come back and remove this Saran wrap as soon as I was done painting in the blue sky off screen. After I removed the plastic wrap, I did think that the sky looked too loud and should have been flatter because the ice had so much noisy texture to itself. So I went back and removed all the stripy cloud implications. And the sky still has a grainy look because that's what watercolor crayon looks like on any sort of non-flat paper, but it's still smoother and lighter than the earlier sky. The water in the mid background also has some texture, but I left that in. It would have been interesting to make it so that the sky and water were both completely flat and the ice was the only texture apart from the polar bears, and that's an interesting idea for a future poster that I might do. I filmed this at night, and yes, I totally shouldn't have done that because it made the video grainy. I didn't realize it was going to do that so much, so I'll avoid nighttime filming whenever I can. If I'd kept to the simplified screen print or stamped woodblock poster style of the original national park posters, I would have had more simple bears. However, as I painted the bears, I ended up gravitating more to my style of painting, so the result is a mix. Simpler than how I paint myself, but softer and more detailed than one of those posters would have been. Maybe I'll do another painting that follows more strictly to the graphic art style of those old posters sometime. I did use the watercolor crayon's thin to medium thin density here, so it looks like a crayon or watercolor piece on this lightly textured paper trimmed out of my moleskin watercolor journal. Keep in mind, if you use these crayons at maximum density, they will go on thick and glossy and look rather like oil or gouache paints, like we saw with this bird in another one of my videos. I did the rough sketch of the bear family some weeks ago. Sometimes if you do a rough sketch and don't come back to it for a long time, you don't remember why you put in certain lines. It's a drawback of stopping at a really rough sketch instead of a more developed drawing. And it is annoying, but it just means the old sketch is less helpful and I just have to re-sketch with my paint. I prefer to do all of the detailed rendering just with the paint anyway, so that part is okay. But also, sometimes what looks like a solid photo reference doesn't turn out to be so solid while you're painting and results in a more tedious rendering phase. You can choose to start anew or just to work with a not so awesome photo reference. This time I just worked with it, and it just took a lot of drawing and erasing with the paint before I was happy with the bears. Luckily, I used watercolor crayons, which like gouache are mostly non-staining and easy to lift off the paper numerous times. If this had been a more detailed piece, I probably would have just started over with a better reference for the bears, but it worked fine for this art style because it has a simpler poster feel. I used an angle brush, a small spotter brush, and a pointed filbert brush for this project. And as I continue to wet into wet and wet on dry draw these bears with my paint, let's talk about composition, which I find a fascinating aspect of art and try to discuss whenever I can in my videos. There are many elements that make various successful compositions, and some elements can change around while keeping certain things in common. Let's look at another bear piece I did in a recent YouTube video. That's right, my original Winnie the Pooh painting has come back. Anyway, note how the shiniest and brightest honey is on his paws. I deliberately put less shiny and bright honey everywhere else since the brightest highlights should be on or near the focal point, which in this case is this silly fictional bear. The darkest darks are also on Pooh, on his red knit sweater, again drawing your eye to the focal point with that contrast. He's also the only thing with eyes in the painting. I didn't even give the bees visible heads, and eyes are a natural focal point. We as humans look at faces instinctively to gauge danger from a foe. I've talked about this before and said that this sense is so strong that you'll see faces even where there are are none, and you might find that out from staring too long at clouds or soap lather. Lastly, both of Pooh's arms create dynamic diagonals. This is helpful again to anchor him as the focal point. He's placed only slightly off-center, so this is more a portrait, icon, or monument composition rather than a golden mean composition. Recall the Eiffel Tower we did in pointillism in another video? That was also a portrait composition, and it also had some dynamic diagonals. Because a portrait composition means the viewer risks being stuck in the center, the artist has to use dynamic elements to keep interest and move your eye around. For the Pooh piece, I relied on the honeypots and the bees, all placed in odd numbers and non-symmetrical groups and varied angles and with different patterns all around to move the gaze through the painting. In comparison, the polar bear piece is more cohesive in colors and quieter in patterns and composition. We are immersed in cool blue-greens and blues all over, and it is only slight color shifts and the change of textures that gives us cues that one or the other is ice or water or sky or bear. And the polar bear composition is following more of a golden mean and rules of thirds, which gives it more movement naturally, so less bells and whistles are needed to scoot the eye around. We tend to just naturally look at the mama bear first. She's a focal point because of her size and position, which is central to her group, and her head also sits at a 1/3 boundary. Then we look around because she's part of an interesting, odd-numbered group of 3, and all 3 bear heads attract our attention due to value contrast and due to being faces. And if you look at any successful composition with more than one face, you'll find that they cannot all be at war for attention. One of them has to be the most attention-grabbing face, and a second or third face will be less so. In this case, the mama bear is the best placed and sized for attention as the main focal point. Among the cubs, the one on our left grabs more attention because we see more of her face. The cub on our right has his head lower and at a side angle, and more of his body is hidden, so we are the least interested in him. Of course, I'm sure he's just as cute as his sibling in real life. Hopefully, you have found this discussion of composition and focal points useful to how you might sketch and stage a drawing for a painting of your own. This naturescape is ready to be its own poster endorsing polar bears. Note how the watercolor crayon really does look like color pencil or crayon when used in thinner layers like this, and I like the color scheme because I'm really partial to cool and soothing color schemes anyway. I'm really happy with the rich and distinctive Seran wrap texture. It was so easy to do that ice, and it's a perfect idea to park a bear family on. As always, wizards, thanks for parking your brushes here. Please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my website links below. If you're interested in buying my originals or prints, please email me or visit my website for info. I hope you paint your own poster supporting wildlife, and until next time, wishing you all fantastical painting adventures.